Hello, my name is Kevin from Hartland College. Today's chapel is presented by Dr. Emerson, and he shows us how fever can help our body to fight diseases. I hope that this presentation will strengthen you and will encourage you to learn more about how our bodies work.
Today we're going to talk about fever. Fever is something that today we perceive as something we have to treat, get rid of. But it was not always so. Historically, it was actually perceived as something beneficial. Hippocrates wrote in the year, oh, by the way, a lot of this material today comes from the research work done by Kluger. Actually wrote a book on fever, and we're going to be talking about him in a minute here. Hippocrates wrote, 400 BC, he said, nature never needs any instruction. A fever, if there's an ulcerative eye lesion, if they got a fever from some other cause, it was actually a good sign that they would be recovering. Rufus of Ephesus, around 100 AD, said, I think you cannot find another drug which eats in a more penetrating manner than fever. For this reason, it's a good remedy for an individual seized with convulsions, and if there's a physician skillful enough to produce a fever, it would be useless to look for any other remedy. And Thomas Nightingale, physician in England, 1689, said, fever is nature's engine which she brings to the field to remove her enemy. This was the feeling about fevers. Leibermeister in 1887 also thought fevers of moderate magnitude and or high magnitude for short periods of time were beneficial. But today, Kluger wrote, today there's widespread trend to reduce all fevers with antipyretics. One might surmise that from this widespread attempt to reduce fevers that convincing evidence had been presented which demonstrated that fevers were harmful. This is not the case, he writes. If anything, the weight of evidence tends to support the opposite conclusion that fevers are actually beneficial. So we want to look at some of that evidence. What is the evidence? Actually, in the late 1800s, Louis Pasteur was studying anthrax to develop an anthrax vaccine. And he found that he could inoculate cows and sheep with anthrax, and they would be dead in a few days. But if he injected it into chickens, they ignored it. They did fine. They didn't get sick. And he wondered why. Well, he was very observant. He noticed that cows and sheep, body temperatures were around 100.4. Chickens' temperatures ran about 104 to 107. I'm sorry, cows were 100.4. So cows much cooler. Sheep were cooler. The chickens apparently had fever all the time. So he thought maybe this higher temperature in the chickens is protecting them. So his next experiment, he takes a chicken, wires his feet to a screen, puts him in a cooling bath, drops his temperature down to about 100.4, injects it with anthrax, and within 24 hours the chicken was dead. I said, wow, that's dramatic. Then he took another chicken, did the same thing, injected with anthrax in this cooling bath. In a few hours, the chicken was starting to get lethargic, drowsy, fatigued, and it was showing symptoms of anthrax toxicity. He took him out of the cooling bath, dried him off, warmed him up. The chicken survived. And this is pretty amazing because it's a fever doesn't, for the chicken, it didn't just make a little difference of him getting rid of his cold or anything. This was the difference between life and death for a chicken, being able to maintain that higher temperature. Another more striking advantage of fevers was found in another disease. Hippocrates, 400 BC, he described a mysterious progressive paralysis. They believed his victims paralyzed, but he noticed if they got a fever from another cause, afterwards, many of them, paralysis went away. He wrote about this, but it wasn't until 2,000 years later that they understood what this paralysis was from. It was caused by a spirochete, syphilis, and it would leave the subjects paralyzed. They discovered that in 1858. Then a psychiatrist who was studying neurosyphilis, that's what they ended up calling it, paralysis from syphilis. In 1887, Wagner Jarrett, a psychiatrist, was studying neurosyphilis, and he noted that in China and India, syphilis was rampant, but they very rarely got paralysis from it. And he wondered why. But he also noted that malaria was rampant there, and he wondered if the fevers from malaria was curing the syphilis. So he did the next normal thing. He took 9 people with neurosyphilis and injected them with malaria. Can't do that today. And 3 of them, paralysis went away. And then, of course, they would treat the malaria. So he's so well with this, they treated thousands of patients with neurosyphilis, injecting them with malaria and causing fevers, which would take care of the syphilis. Now, I thought, well, that's pretty bizarre, but someone didn't think it was bizarre because in 1927, he got the Nobel Prize in Medicine and Physiology for treating neurosyphilis with fevers given through this malaria injection. Other diseases have been treated with fevers. Typhoid vaccine was used to treat resistant forms of gonorrhea. And however, they could, if they gave a gram-negative bacteria, sometimes that could also cause septic shock, and they couldn't do that. They were sort of experimenting with how best to give fevers. Polio was successfully treated with fever baths. One lifestyle center, we had a patient whose mother and aunt both got polio as children. One was treated with fever baths. She recovered completely. The other wasn't. She had residual effects from the polio. Is there more recent evidence of the beneficial effects of fever? Yes, in animal studies, it has been shown to be very beneficial. Kluger, who did some of the work in the early 1970s, he was trying to figure out, is there an animal whose temperature I can control? Well, during a really boring lecture, all of a sudden it hit him. I need the lizard, because the lizard is an ectoderm. And an ectoderm is an animal that can only control its body temperature by moving from the shade to the sun. And that's how he gets his temperature hotter, and if he wants to get cooler, he has to move back to the shade again. So he set up a tank, shade, sun, and sun lamp, and he put lizards in it, and he put little thermocouples in their rectums, which can measure their temperature. And the lizards would run back and forth, but they ran to an area where their temperature was 38 degrees Celsius, which is close to human body temperature. Then he infected them with hydrophilobacteria, and they migrated from the shade to the sun lamp. Temperature rose to 40 to 42 degrees Celsius. They got better, and then they moved back to the shade again. They did just fine. Then he took lizards and he infected them all with hydrophilobacteria, but some of them he kept at the top line, he kept at 42 degrees Celsius, and here is time, days on the bottom. The top is percent survival at different days. If you notice, at 3 days, he had 95% survival. But the lizards he kept at 40 degrees Celsius, 3 days, it was down to 70% survival. And at 34 degrees, none of them survived. Now you think, okay, well, why don't lizards just maintain the temperature high all the time? Well, if you notice at the top, 42 degrees Celsius, that's a fever for a lizard. Beyond 3 days, if you kept them at that temperature, they started dying. 80% survival at 7 days. They weren't dying from the hydrophilobacteria. They were dying from exhaustion. It's very exhausting managing a fever, and they were just wearing out. So we don't want to have fevers all the time, but we do want fevers when we have a battle to fight to get rid of the infections. What about the practice of giving aspirin to treat a fever? This is what they did. They took some lizards, and the top line, they infected them with hydrophilobacteria. They did not give them aspirin. 100% survival by day 7. The other group, they infused aspirin into the lizard, and that prevented the lizards from resetting his thermostat higher. He stayed in the shade, and by 3 days they were all dead from that. By the way, do you know when the feeling that fevers were bad came? around the 50s when they started developing antipyretics, things to lower fevers. And now you weren't a good mother or a good nurse unless you treated the fever with the antipyretics. That's what changed the feelings about fevers. Similar effects were found with goldfish. Goldfish, they have a different way of mounting a fever. If you ever jumped into a lake in the summer, the deeper you go, the colder it gets. Well, a goldfish would be at a temperature, at a lower temperature. They'd be deep in the water. When they get infected with the hydrophila, they would rise to a higher level of water that was warmer, and that was their fever. They would get better and then drop back down again. And here we see the same things we saw with the lizards. If the lizards were kept at 25 degrees Celsius, only 20% were alive at 72 hours. But if they were allowed to maintain a temperature of 32.7 degrees Celsius, they were still alive at the end of the 72 hours. So these are reptiles and fish. What about mammals, like you and I? Are fevers beneficial? They did look at weasels, and they did a correlative study. They infected them with influenza virus, then they did washings from their nose every 4 hours, and they measured the viral particles in the washings. And they found that the weasels that had higher temperatures, they cleared the virus much more quickly than if they had lower temperatures. So a higher temperature cleared the virus more rapidly. This is a study with newborn mice. They infect them with Coxsackie bee virus. If they're newborn, it's usually fatal because the newborn mice can't mount fevers until they're older. So in this study, they infected the newborn mice, and half of them they incubated at 34 degrees Celsius. They survived. The others at the lower temperature did not survive. Similar study done with puppies, newborn puppies. They also have lower temperatures. They can't mount fevers. And when you infect them with herpes canine virus, if they don't get their mother's milk and get antibodies from their mother's milk, they die. Well, they took a bunch of newborn puppies, infected them all with herpes canine virus, and half of them they incubated, brought the temperature up to 101 to 103 degrees Fahrenheit, rectal temperatures. By day 9, they were all living. The others that they left at room temperature, by day 9, they were all dead. They had all died. So again, a few degrees Celsius made the difference between life and death. They sacrificed one that had lived, that was at the higher temperature, and they did pathology exam. They found that the virus had started to form in the brain, but it got walled off with fibrous tissue and stopped. The ones that had been kept at lower temperature, they found the virus was spread throughout the body and caused little necrotic holes throughout the brain, and that's what eventually killed the dogs. They also took adult dogs. By the way, if a dog grows to be 2 weeks old and gets herpes canine virus, he has higher body temperatures, he can mount a fever, they just get a little runny nose. They don't die like the newborn puppies. Another look at the older dogs. They took some older dogs that can mount fevers, they anesthetized them, put them to sleep, anesthetized them. Some of them they kept at 100 to 102 degrees Celsius, others they kept cooler. The ones at the cooler temperature, when they sacrificed them, the virus was throughout the body. The others that kept at the higher temperature and sacrificed, the virus was walled off and the immune system eradicated the virus. So what causes a fever anyway? Well, there's actually a mechanism in our body to generate a fever. And as creationist, I believe that if there is a mechanism to do something, that a loving God put that mechanism there for a reason. What's the mechanism? Well, the mechanism is here. Up at the top left, you see E. coli. If it gets into the bloodstream, the white cells sense it, and release interleukin-1. Interleukin stimulates the production of prostaglandin E1 and E2. This goes to the brain and resets your thermostat up to 102. But your temperature is 98.6. So you feel cold, put a blanket on, you start shaking, you generate heat, that brings your temperature up to 102. Or if you're at Hartland, you get in a fever bath, and that brings your temperature up to 102. Anyway, you get 102, and that is maintained, and when that happens, your immune system is turned on. And we'll see what that means. And it's turned on, it fights the viral infection, and now, when your infection is gone, your body temperature is reset, your thermostat's reset at 98.6, but you're still at 102. So now you feel hot because your temperature is exceeding your thermostat. You throw off the blanket, break out in a sweat, and that brings your temperature down. That's when they call the fever broke, is when you break out in a sweat. That's been considered a good sign. It means your body senses that there's no longer an infection, and we can turn the thermostat down. The other time the thermostat will get turned down is if your body's getting exhausted and said, we need a rest right now. It'll turn it down, and then a few hours later, or next day, it may crank up again to do a second assault on infection. How do, let's here. How do fevers stimulate the immune system? Some fevers can actually, the higher temperature can actually kill bacteria directly. Gonococci can do. However, syphilis, we don't get fevers high enough to kill a syphilis bacteria or spirochetes directly. So how does it work? How does fever work? Well, one thing, these are T lymphocytes. They are one of the first lines of defense against viruses and tumors. When an infection occurs, fevers stimulate the production of T lymphocytes. T lymphocytes at 102 degrees are produced 20 times faster than temperatures at 98.6. So higher temperatures stimulate lymphocyte production. Interferon, another chemical which helps you fight viruses and tumors and bacteria. The interferon becomes 3 times more effective in fighting a virus in tissue culture at a higher temperature. And interferon production itself also increases at the higher temperature. Here, these are anthrax bacteria. And we've got little white cells, that's the yellow structure there. They're gobbling up the anthrax. Turns out at higher temperatures, the white cells' mobility increases dramatically. They move faster and they gobble up bacteria faster at a higher temperature. When they're at about 40 degrees Celsius, their activity increases dramatically. Also, many bacteria need iron to live. And when you get an infection, fever, this stimulates white cells to release a substance that binds the serum, free serum iron, and lowers its concentration. So it starves the bacteria. The bacteria don't have enough iron to live, and it helps fight the infection. We have an anemia of chronic disease. It's in internal medicine. When you have chronic inflammation, this process is going on all the time, and you'll have an anemia. A lot of times physicians will work up the anemia and say, oh, you're losing blood somewhere, when in fact it's from the inflammation. Your body's lowering it intentionally. And lizards will use this to fight infections. Here, this lizard's here. If he is unable, experimentally, if they prevent the iron level from dropping, if he gets hydrophila bacteria, the fever itself is not enough to kill the hydrophila, but when you allow the iron to drop, then he's able to clear the infection. And rabbits do a similar thing with their immune system. So now this works for infection. I think the first time I had an infection or experienced this was when I was asked to cover a lifestyle center up in Michigan in February. And when I got up there, it was ice cold, freezing, and I understood why I was covering for the physician who wasn't there. And I realized why that physician wasn't there. It was cold. Anyway, we had to walk with the patients, and I got this viral infection, and the people in the lifestyle center said, "Oh, here, come." They didn't know I had an infection, but they said, "We just got a new light box." It was a box full of lights in it. And they said, "Try out our light box." And so I got in the light box and my swimsuit and got this light, and within 4 or 5 minutes, I was breaking out in a sweat. I was really amazed. Held it there for 5, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. I got out, took a warm shower, and the next day, the symptoms of this virus was gone. It was very powerful. If you have a way of doing this when you get an infection, it's very effective. One of the simple ways you can do this at home is sit in a chair, get in a bathing suit, sit in a chair, put a blanket around yourself, and get an electric tea kettle and put it under the chair. The steam will come up, the blanket tight around your neck, use a clothespin, it will make it like a steam bath, and within a few minutes, you will be in a sweat, and you can actually maintain that for 10, 15 minutes. Take a warm shower, go to bed, get warm, and it can take these viral symptoms away. Very effective. Tomorrow, we're going to see how elevating body temperatures how it is being used today to fight infections. And not just infections, but cancer as well. So we'll look forward to seeing you.